I read that 43 students in Mexico disappeared. Supposedly, allegedly, the police took them, handed them over to a local gang who has killed them. Some gang members have confessed that. And the mayor of the town and his wife were on the run, and they've just been caught in Mexico City. And apparently it was the mayor that said, don't let the students talk because my wife is speaking at the same time, so don't let the students protest. It will disturb her speech. So it's just, but the students now are demonstrating en masse in Mexico City, and rightly so, I should think. But they want hard evidence. They don't want reports of what's happened. They want evidence.
That's right.
Well, what's happened behind the scenes? What don't I know?
Well, what you don't know is that the students had been protesting against corruption, austerity measures, cuts to education, corruption, and what happened was that the government basically admitted that they had turned the students over to local gang. It's difficult to use the word gang and gang members because in English language we think of street gangs. These are more like high-functioning narco-trafficking cartels. So that's the first distinction. And the second distinction is that, you know, there was just so much overwhelming evidence that the government did this, that the government, you know, didn't need to admit this in order to admit this, if that makes any sense. It was something that, by actually saying that it was narco-traffickers, they're actually trying to sidestep their own responsibility. The real problem, Morris, in the failing state of Mexico is that there's not a difference between different governmental and narco-trafficking organizations. They are heavily embedded. They are at war with each other because there's actually a war in Mexico between different types of governmental groups. So it's really, really problematic. I mean, this is connected to the real inside scoop here, of course, is that this is just a permutation of a larger problem where the U.S. and Israel are dedicated to creating a failed state in Mexico.
Well, first of all, just clarify, when you say the government is the likely culprit in their disappearance, do you mean the federal government or just the local government?
No, the local government.
Okay.
And well, the federal government in Mexico has pretty much lost complete control of many territories in Mexico. They're run by a sort of a synergy of local U.S.-backed and Israeli-backed drug cartels combined, which we know about from going way back in time now, combined with local governmental structures. It began as corruption, but keep in mind that in order to be corrupt, you needed to have started from a position of not being corrupt, if that makes any sense. And what we really have now is this is actually just the government on the local level are these synergies of drug cartels that keep the water running, if that makes sense. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, Israel does have a huge presence there, and we know the criminal element within Mexico. It's totally collapsed in the last few years. It never had such a reputation before. But why would Mexico be the target? It had a nationalized oil service. It had some form of socialism in the past. I mean, why would Mexico be targeted to become a failed state?
Yeah, well, it borders on the U.S., and on the other side of Mexico is the rest of Latin America. And as we've reported, and as your audience knows, and as the whole world's been talking about, and this happens to be true, is that Latin America has been pulling out of the U.S. Sphere of influence because of linguistic and cultural and trade ties. It would make sense that Mexico, a good sizable portion thereof, would be pulled into this larger Mercosur, common economic bloc in Latin America. The U.S. doesn't want to do this. So this sort of parallels Ukraine and that in the same way that that they were trying to make a failed state in Central Europe to separate Russia from Europe, they don't want the United States to be overwhelmed economically by a growing common market in Latin America. So they would like to create a failed state in Mexico, and they also get to accomplish a lot of secondary and tertiary objectives, such as keeping the drug flow coming into the United States, which, of course, anesthetizes the masses and creates the pretext for the war on drugs and crime and the prison industrial complex. And so there's a number of issues that are tangled up there, as we can see.
And probably they're somewhat spiteful because Mexico continuously supported Cuba throughout the embargo in defiance of the United States. That was probably a big thorn.
That's right. Yes. And what's interesting is that, Mexico, by all accounts, through the 1980s and 1990s, was a basically normal society. It had the sort of types of normal levels of corruption, if we can talk about it in those terms, that you used to see in other parts of the world, including, say, small towns in the United States, where the local sheriff, is friends with the judge, and in order to get a building permit, you had to pay the right people. So that was normal practice in Mexico. That's what Americans used to mean when they talked about corruption in Mexico. Of course, they were doing a little bit of othering when doing that, Morris. But moving forward from the 80s and 90s, it just got out of hand. The government's been falling apart. They've lost so much credibility. There's been a few rigged elections. Basically, the ruling PRI established a neoliberal wing about 20-something years ago called the PAN, and together they staged a transition of power as the PRI had been ruling for some 60 years at the time, now off and on for almost 80 years. But the real revolutionary heir to the ruling PRI, many consider to be the PRD. And the PRD's been essentially kept out of national politics. A few years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, the leader of the PRD became the mayor of Mexico City, which was really, people were optimistic. I'm not saying the PRD is without faults or that they aren't, they're not perfect, of course. But people were very optimistic that the PRD would be able to make some changes, make better relations with the rest of Latin America, especially Venezuela. And so what happened is the mayor of the Obrador ran for president of Mexico, and by all accounts he won. He was robbed of this election. It was sort of like the U.S. thing with the Diebold voting scandal. And so what happened is, increasing layers of Mexican society, including peasants, workers, the intelligentsia, small business, medium business, even large businesses, increasingly disaffected and have lost confidence in the Mexican government. This is complicated because people at the same time who have money and can't trust the government need to turn to local drug lords and gang cartels who are embedded with also American interests as well as Israeli. So the whole thing's a mess. In the south of Mexico, you tend to have more indigenous people, and what we have happening right now is Israeli firms have been brought in to create their cartographic firms. They make maps, but they're also anthropologic firms, and what they're doing is they're making human maps of where the last remaining indigenous groups, people who speak dialects related to Nahuatl and other pre-Columbian languages where people still live in pre-Columbian cultures. And these, I feel they need to be protected. This is part of human diversity, and these people have a right to exist in their way. And the Israelis are coming in under the pretext of mapping water routes in order to privatize the water systems and to privatize access to water. But what they're really that is mapping where indigenous people live. As we know, about 18 years ago, there was a massive indigenous uprising led by the EZLN in the south of Mexico, coming out of the Chiapas state. And so one of the things that the U.S. has collaborated with the Mexican government and the Israelis to do is to really nip that in the bud and to, of course, engage in classic counterinsurgency measures.
It feels as if Israel, being the vanguard of the NWO, has a war against indigenous people. It's a theme I commonly express. Very sad to hear that account from you.
It is. It's very strange. I mean, one understands Israel, I mean, doesn't make excuses for it, but one can understand in the sort of traditional logic of regional hegemony within that, in that discourse of geopolitics, why Israel would, say, be putting pressure on Syria or Egypt, or one can understand the logic of regional hegemonic struggle. But what Israel is doing in Latin America, what Israel is doing in Mexico, I think that is very troubling and really points to something more fundamental to the nature of Israel's role in the Anglo-Zionist empire. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm very, very grateful for that account.